live in an era of relatively stable hardware platforms. Regardless of form factor, there isn't much difference between any active video game console. You can argue about specs, but a game for one platform will play pretty much the same as that same game released on another platform. This wasn't true in the 1980s. Back then, every platform had wildly different hardware, and you weren't building your games on engines that trivialized porting. So when a game got ported between platforms, decisions that were made for the original version were often reflected on other platforms, even when they weren't really appropriate. I'm bringing this up because Yokai Yashiki is really obviously an MSX game. Casio created the original Yokai Yashiki, releasing it about a year before the Disk System version. That original MSX version shares some of the same concepts, but the stages are completely different, and so are some of the bosses. The Disk System version also added a lot more enemies and power-ups, so really you would consider this to be kind of a pseudo-sequel to the MSX version. The plot of the game is that on the edge of town there was a yokai mansion, where all of the monsters in Japan had been sealed up. You and your girlfriend snuck in there and accidentally released the monsters, so now you have to put things right and rescue your girlfriend. There are 5 stages in Yokai Yashiki, and they follow the same fundamental structure. Collect 5 talismans, and then enter the proper location to confront the boss. There's no scrolling here, every screen stands on its own, and naturally the monsters are restored if you exit a screen and then come back. An annoying aspect of this game is that the map is extra confusing. A lot of screens are duplicated, and a lot of them are linked in ways that don't make any kind of linear sense. Not even an infinitely looping section. Fortunately, there is a map. You can access it by hitting the select button. Also, you can't really tell which ways you can exit unless you bump up against the edge of the screen, and you can't enter the boss's room until you find all 5 talismans, so once you've done that, you're basically going back through the whole stage bumping up against walls until you find the new path that opened. The talismans are also often positioned where you only have one shot at getting them, and if you didn't make the jump or pick the wrong path, then you have to loop back through the whole stage in order to get another shot at it. An important navigational trick to be aware of are the wells, some of which burst into flames periodically. You can stand on these and press down to warp between wells, though which one you come out of is random, and it might burst into flames immediately after you come out. There are places where you have to use the well to get out of the area, but for the most part you're probably going to want to avoid using them. As you're playing, A jumps and B shoots. Holding down up and hitting A will give you a little bit floatier of a jump, which doesn't sound like a big deal, but there's spots where low ceilings will send you down, unless you take advantage of that tiny boost that holding down up gives you. Your weapon is a flashlight, and the strength of the flashlight depends on how many batteries you have. Fortunately, those don't go down with use. You can mash the B button and blast all of the yokai that you want. Unfortunately, the batteries are also your life bar, so as you get hit, your attacks become much worse. First, the batteries run down, going empty, and then if you get hit after that, you lose some of your maximum battery gauge. At the start of the game, you have 3 empty battery gauges, and you gain charge by defeating these spirit balls. On later stages, they appear as regular enemies throughout the area, and they basically become the easiest way of restoring your health. You can also find rice balls laying around, and you can refill your entire battery gauge by kneeling in front of one of these statues when you have a rice ball. Or at least that's what the manual says. I couldn't get it to work. I suspect this is a situation where it requires pixel-perfect placement. The ladders and ropes have a similar problem, so it might not be as convenient to use as you'd like. You can also find items by blasting open light sources like lamps. You could find a candle which will restore a small amount of energy, or a battery that will increase your maximum battery gauge. The items that you get from light sources are random, and light sources don't respawn when you leave the screen and come back. Except on some stages they do respawn. There isn't a lot of consistency in Youkai Yashiki. There is a maximum length for the battery gauge, and that increases as you progress. So on stage 1 you have a maximum length of 4, on stage 2 that increases to 5, and so on. Other items that you can find in the light sources are points, 2 different ways of becoming invincible, and an item that lets you do more damage for about 5 seconds. When it comes time to go fight the boss, you want your battery gauge to be at its maximum. Not for the extra health, but because you're going to need the extra range. The bosses tend to screen themselves with their attacks, and unless you have enough range to hit them, you're going to have a really difficult time getting close. You only have 1 life in Youkai Yashiki, but you do get infinite continues. Though when you continue, you do go back to having a completely empty battery gauge, and that means that any hit will permanently weaken you. You'll have to explore and avoid enemies until you can find a way to refill your gauge. Trying to find people who had memories of playing Youkai Yashiki, almost everything I could find was about the MSX version, which people apparently liked a lot. The Famicom Disk System version, on the other hand, just gets absolutely no attention. The very few people I could find who had anything to say at all mentioned that they found the maps to be incredibly confusing. My own feelings on Youkai Yashiki are that it's not a great game, but it is a decent attempt, especially for 1987. Mechanically, I feel like its biggest flaw isn't the confusing level layout, it's the way that your health bar and flashlight strength are the same meter. It winds up forcing you to grind for health instead of playing naturally. Youkai Yashiki is a perfectly fine, perfectly average game for the Famicom Disk System. It's the kind of thing that if you had it in 1987, you'd play it, then you'd probably want to rewrite it with something actually good. And thinking about it that way, maybe that's why people don't really remember this one.